Okay, I'd like to do a second installment of what we began the last time I had the opportunity to speak on Wednesday evening, and you'll remember the subject was the BGCT, the Baptist General Convention of Texas, in which we participate, we cooperate as a giving church. And I told you that I think that there are four leaders from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century that really pretty much define who the BGCT is. I didn't invent this. It just came to me one day when I was doing some study about these four men, and I noticed that one of their names began with a B, and another a G, and another a C, and another a T. So it just worked out that way. Do you remember the first one? We talked about maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago. Robert Buckner. Does anybody remember from where he hailed? Originally, before he came to Texas, was another T state. Tennessee. So we're going to bracket this. We begin with a T and we end with a T. The last T is Truett, George Truett, and he's a native Texan from beginning to end. And in between, we got one Mississippi, two Mississippi. And we had three Mississippi who prayed for us just a moment ago, okay? The two from Mississippi are J.B. Gambrell and B.H. Carroll. So let me tell you why I've chosen them. Buckner is the epitome of social ministry and media publications, and for that reason, we began with him because he's B, not because he's more important than the others. We're going to end with Truett because he's probably the preeminent pulpiteer and preacher, but also a strong advocate of church-state separation and pastor. And the two in between, Gambrell tonight because of his denominational leadership. If there was a denominational man, it was J.B. Gambrell and all that involves. Now, all of these were leaders in the denomination, but he really epitomized denominational leadership. And then, of course, B.H. Carroll we'll talk about next time I'm up. And he's because he was a preeminent pastor, teacher, educator, and also a denominational man. So having said that, there's a text, I think, that really relates to Gambrell and what he was about after a heritage of a couple of hundred years, in fact, that he was fulfilling. And it's found in Isaiah 54, and I'm going to ask Gail if she'll come read the first 7 verses.
Shout for joy, O barren one, you have borne no child. Break forth into joyful shouting and cry aloud, you who have not travailed. For the sons of the desolate one will be more numerous than the sons of the married woman, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out the curtains of your dwellings, spare not. Lengthen your cords, and strengthen your pegs. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations, and they will resettle the desolate cities. Fear not, for you will not be put to shame, neither feel humiliated, for you will not be disgraced. But you will forget the shame of your youth, and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. For your husband is your maker, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth. For the Lord has called you, like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, even like a wife of one's youth when she is rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you.
We'll come back to that text in a moment, but 1841, August the 21st in South Carolina, in Anderson County, South Carolina, J.B. Gambrell was born. James Burton. You know, all those guys went by initials, didn't they, back in that day and time? I know very few people that only go by initials today. Most of them, there's a name behind them, but sometimes there wasn't a name behind them. In this case, there was. He was the son of Joel Burton, there's the Burton, Gambrell, and Elvira Williams. His family had immigrated about a century before from the southern part of England, from Kent, the county where Canterbury is, and they had moved into South Carolina. A couple of his great-grandfathers were revolutionary soldiers, so he was a son of the Revolution, and his family then moved out of South Carolina when he was the age of 4. They were farmers. They moved across, bypassed Georgia, went through Alabama and didn't stop, and they ended up just west of Tupelo, Mississippi, in Pontotoc County. He was converted at the age of 15 at Pleasant Ridge Baptist Church. I looked for it. I can't find Pleasant Ridge Baptist Church anymore, so it probably doesn't exist there. There isn't one in another county, but it was 1856. He was a 15-year-old young man, and then the Civil War started, and he joined along with one of his brothers at least, and he was a scout. He was a scout for, everybody says, for General Lee. Well, everybody served under General Lee that was in the Confederacy. Particularly, he was under General A.P. Hill, and he was a scout, leading a foraging and scouting party in Pennsylvania in 1863. And they looked in the wood line ahead of them, and they saw blue uniforms moving across the horizon, and they started shooting at them. And then began one of the most important battles, not only in the Civil War, but American history. Which battle was it in Pennsylvania? Battle of Gettysburg. So he claims to have fired the first shot at the Battle of Gettysburg. Not long after that, his brother at the end of the battle, Ira, the second lieutenant, was killed in that battle. And he was promoted to captain and sent to the west out to Memphis. And of course, that's where Grant was causing trouble for the Confederacy. He had met on one of his forays beyond enemy lines on his scouting ventures a young lady. She was the cousin to the wife of General Pickett, and he fell in love. And about a year later, he got permission from her parents to marry her, Mary T. Corbell. The only problem was, by this time, the Union lines were too far south. And so in order to meet her, he had to infiltrate enemy lines. He got a preacher to marry them at 1 o'clock in the morning, and then he exfiltrated, came back through enemy lines with her, and they headed back out to Mississippi. They eventually had 9 children in their marriage. He was ordained after the war in 1867. He was 26 years old at Cherry Creek Baptist Church in Pontotoc County, and he was pastor of Cherry Creek Church, and that still exists, to my knowledge, and a number of other country churches, and he taught school in the countryside. But then he was called to West Point, Mississippi Baptist Church, and West Point is where David's mother is from. Is she there now? She's in West Point. And from 1870 to 1873. And then he was called to the big city. Well, it wasn't really a big city. It was Oxford. Oxford's still not a really big city, kind of off the beaten path. But why is Oxford, Mississippi notable? Ole Miss is there. So for 5 years, he was pastor of the Oxford Baptist Church, and he enrolled in some classes at the University of Mississippi while he was pastor. And then he became the editor of the Baptist paper for Mississippi. It had just been launched in 1877, and he became the editor, and he published it out of his home there in Oxford. And then he moved it to Clinton, Mississippi in 1881. He was called as the pastor of Clinton Baptist Church. Now, if you know your geography of Mississippi, that's right off of I-20 now, which wasn't there, of course, but it's a neighborhood of which big city? Jackson, the capital. And there he helped to raise funds for Mississippi College. He edited the paper, and he pastored the church, and he campaigned much like J. Frank Norris did here in Fort Worth. What did J. Frank Norris campaign for here in Fort Worth? To clean up the city of all the honky-tonks and saloons and all of the disreputable activities. And he campaigned against that. And his son was about 20 years old, his eldest son, Roderick Du Gambrell. And Gambrell had started publishing a paper called The Sword and Shield, which is a reform paper, in addition to the State Baptist paper. And his son was editing it. And he got quite a reputation for being opposed to the liquor trade and a reformer. And he was ambushed right in the shade of the Capitol building in 1887 by 7 assassins. And a mob then came to the courthouse because the ringleader had been captured. And the mob stormed the Capitol building, and Gambrell himself intervened. And he told the mob to disperse, that the man should get justice from the courts. Well, he didn't really. He was acquitted, but he was acquitted only because 4 of the jurors had been bribed. But that tells you something about the character of the man. He then began to work with J.M. Frost in the early 1890s. Frost had a plan to implement a nationwide Sunday school system in Southern Baptist life and to form a board for it called the Sunday School Board. And at first Gambrell was opposed to it, but the more he thought about it, he was opposed to it because, and I don't really understand what he meant by this, but he said that it was too immature. Now, I don't know if he meant that the grade level was too low or if it was not a well-born plan at that time. But Frost convinced him of the viability of the plan, and Gambrell became one of the great advocates for it. And in 1891, the Sunday School Board started. Now, what does that relate to today? What is the Sunday School Board today? Lifeway, yeah. So the beginnings of that were in 1891, and Frost was a big advocate of that. He was also a strong advocate of the BYPU. I hear some laughter. Some of you know what the BYPU, the Baptist Young People's Union. And so it became then what? Baptist BTU, Baptist Training Union, and then it became Training Union, TU, and then it became what? It disappeared, yeah. Then he was called as president of Mercer University in Macon. He was there for 3 years from 1893 to 96. Now, by this time, he's in his 40s. And after serving well there as the president, they expected him to stay the rest of his life. He didn't. He was called in as the corresponding secretary of the new convention in Texas. Hadn't been started but about 20 years before. And there was all kinds of infighting and difficulty. They couldn't agree on the candidate to become the executive secretary. He was called the corresponding secretary back then. And then, before the search committee came the name of this president from Mercer, Mississippian who was serving in Georgia, and they looked at his resume and decided to call him as the corresponding secretary. He served 13 years as the corresponding secretary and brought unity to the convention through his leadership. And he and B.H. Carroll, one of B.H. Carroll's many brothers, J.M. Carroll, then put their minds together and formed what is called the Education Commission. Before then, the convention was involved in education, but there wasn't a systematic plan to coordinate the universities and the colleges that were supported by Baptist money in Texas. And so they put together the Education Commission. He also was involved and instrumental in bringing Southwestern Seminary to Fort Worth. It had started actually at Baylor. Y'all know that story, 1907, 1908. And Gambrell then was one of the men that filed the petition to the government for the charter for Southwestern Seminary, and he was instrumental, along with, of course, B.H. Carroll, in moving it then from there to Fort Worth. And in fact, he was the first chairman of the Board of Trustees, and then not long after that, he taught at Southwestern for 2 years from 1912 to 1914, while he then began to edit the Baptist State Paper. What is the Baptist State Paper of the BGCT? The Baptist Standard. It had been purchased from J. Frank Norris, and it was owned at that time by George W. Truett, Robert Buckner, and a fellow by the name of H.Z. Duke and C.D. Fine, and also by Gambrell. And in the next couple of years, they decided to go ahead and sell out and transfer the ownership to the BGCT so that it would not be personality-based. Quite a heritage there. He resumed teaching in 1916 at Southwestern after he had taken a second stint as the corresponding secretary of the BGCT for a couple of years. So he served a total of 15 years. And he taught at Southwestern until his death. And he served 4 terms as the president of the SBC, 1970 and 1920. Just before he died, he and E.Y. Mullins and George W. Truett went to London. And there was a big conference called the London Conference of Baptists. They were very concerned about the state of Europe after World War I, about the need for funding to help Baptist churches there and to develop Baptist work there. And as you probably know, that was the beginning of the Baptist World Alliance. And Gambrell was instrumental in helping to start that. He returned here and began to worked very diligently to support the BWA, and he really overtaxed himself. His heart couldn't take the strain, and he had a heart attack here in Fort Worth as he was walking down the street. Went to his home in Dallas, and then he died a few months later in June of 1921. I tell you all of that to give you the background of his denominational involvement. That is the man after whom the street is named and after which the church is named. They had 9 children. I tracked as many of them down as I could. And in fact, there is living today a J.B. Gambrell IV. He's living in London, England, as far as I can tell, and I've tried to get in touch with him to see if he would like to know more about Gambrell Street. So, continuing the tradition, what does that have to do with things? You know, when you look at the background of this passage, most of you probably caught that text in verse number 2. It's one of the preeminent mission texts in Baptist life. The background is that Israel is about to go into exile, into captivity. It's been prophesied by Isaiah. Difficult times are coming. You will experience sorrow like a barren widow. What does that sort of remind you of? Who was a barren widow? Abraham's wife? Sarah, but God gave a promise and she had a child. Who else? Rachel also. So you have this kind of analogous picture of Israel once again being barren. But God gives them a message of redemption and a hopeful future here. He says, I'm going to restore you, I'm going to bring you back, and you're going to be useful to me again. You see in verse number 5, if you got Isaiah 54 there. For your husband is your maker. You may think that you're a barren widow, Israel, but your husband is your maker. I am your husband, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth. This is a great missionary text. It's talking about God, Jehovah God, Elohim God, the God of Israel, is the God of all the earth. And here he then gives a command to Israel to fulfill part of that hope of the future. Part of it's implied. Your attitude should change. You should claim this promise and challenge that I'm giving you, and you should be positive about what I'm about to do to you. I'm going to strengthen you with my encouragement here in this message. And in verse number 2, we have the explicit command. And what is it? Enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch out the curtains of your dwellings, of your habitations. Spare not. Lengthen the cords and strengthen the stakes. Now, the 2 aspects of this command. One is expand the kingdom, and the other is strengthen the kingdom. When you look at its historical application in Baptist life, any of you that know anything about Baptist history know why it's relevant. But if you don't, bear with me a moment. It was in 1792 when William Carey was meeting with a fraternal group of ministers that normally met in Northamptonshire, but they were meeting in Nottingham at that time, and they'd asked him to preach their basically associational sermon. And he preached his great deathless sermon, and he preached it from this text, Isaiah 54:2. And his catchphrase in that was, expect great things from God, and you know how to finish it. What? Attempt great things for God. This led eventually in October of that year when they met again in Kettering and the house of Martha Wallace. It led them then to form what we call the BMS today, the Baptist Missionary Society. It had a longer name back then, a particular Baptist Society for the propagation of the gospel among the heathen, but that's something that you can't put in 3 letters, okay? So it became the Baptist Missionary Society, and Andrew Fuller collected 13 pounds, 2 shillings and 6 pence and put it in his snuff box, and that made him the treasurer for the next 20-something years of the BMS. It was this text then that was used by Carey to launch the modern mission movement in Baptist life. There were plenty of other mission movements at that time, but in Baptist life. And there are 2 aspects of this text that really are important and that I think relate to Gambrell and to BGCT. One is expand the kingdom. The other is strengthen the kingdom. You know, enlarge your tent. That's obvious. Stretch out the curtains of your dwellings. And the emphasis there in denominational life is what? It's missions and evangelism. And the goals of that first part have always been win souls. Win souls. let the Holy Spirit use you to win souls for Christ. But there's also an ecclesiological goal there. There's also a church-based goal, and that is to plant and grow churches as a result. Don't let souls just go off on their own. Plant churches, bring them together, grow churches, and they should become, as William Carey said, self-supporting, self-propagating, and self-governing, the three self concept. So that's one part of this, and we get that. That's great as Baptists, and we've always emphasized that. But the other side of it is to strengthen the kingdom. It's not just to grow the kingdom, it's to strengthen the kingdom, to give support to those folks that go on mission, to educate them and to train them, and to give them ongoing support afterward. And that's to lengthen the cords. So you get the picture. You're going on the mission field. We are going to keep a cord connected to you, and that cord is going to offer what? Financial support, it's going to offer prayer support, and it's going to offer logistical support to you. We lengthen the cord as you go. It's sort of like a bungee cord, and we're there. We're at the other end of it. But the other part of it is to strengthen the stakes. How do you strengthen the stakes in denominational life, in church life? Education, publication, and the use of newspapers. That's the way Baptists have done it. So you look at Gambrell's contribution here. Newspaper life. He published the Baptist Record in Mississippi, which, by the way, just this month finally went totally digital. Okay, yeah. For 143 years they've printed. Now they're going digital. Okay, they're in the 21st century. But it's the third largest Baptist paper in the country. 100,000 circulation. He edited the Baptist Standard, and it's been digital for some time. He published then this Sword and Shield as a reforming newspaper. Education, look at what he did. He raised funds for an endowment for Mississippi College. He was president of Mercer University. He established the Education Commission of Texas. He was a trustee and professor at Southwestern, and he was a strong supporter of discipleship training, BYPU and Sunday School. Mission organization, he was executive director, basically, that's what the corresponding secretary was, for 15 years. 4-term president of the SBC and helped start the BWA. And in fact, there is a Gambrell Baptist Association in Texas. I look for, one of the problems we have as Baptists is we need to do a better job of recording our history somewhere. I looked high and low, and I couldn't find when Gambrell Association started. I know it was around in 1921 because there was a church that joined it. Anybody know where Gambrell Association has been? It's just southeast of San Antonio, and it's merged with Gonzales Association to form the South Central Baptist area, so it's still associational. Okay, well, let me close with this. So where does that leave us? In terms of what we do in denominational life, I read from the Baptist Faith and Message last time about benevolence and social ministry. Cooperation. This is what Gambrell was about. Christ's people should, as occasion requires, Article 14, organize such associations and conventions as may best secure cooperation for the great objects of the kingdom of God. Such organizations have no authority over one another or over the churches. They're voluntary and advisory bodies designed to elicit, combine, and direct the energies of our people in the most effective manner. Members of the New Testament churches should cooperate with one another in carrying forward the missionary, educational, and benevolent ministries for the extension of Christ's kingdom. Christian unity in the New Testament sense is spiritual harmony and voluntary cooperation for common ends by various groups of Christ's people. Cooperation is desirable between the various Christian denominations when the end to be attained is itself justified, and when the cooperation involves no violation of conscience or compromise of loyalty to Christ and His Word as revealed in the New Testament. To me, that epitomizes what the namesake of this church was about as a denominational leader. Today, the BGCT, there are 5,600 churches that cooperate together with about 1.7 million members. This year, we have a $35 million budget. 79% of it stays in the state, 21% goes to the Executive Committee for Mission Causes Beyond Texas. We talk about the cooperative program, and we do give to the cooperative program, and the Mary Hill Davis offering, which we've mentioned last time. But it also collects a hunger offering, and it also collects for the Texas Baptist Missions Foundation. The current director of the BGCT executive director is David Hartage. He has visited in this church. He preached here when we had our centenary celebration. David has just announced this month that after 10 years, he is retiring from that position. And they are constituting a search committee to find the new executive director for the BGCT. It's the 137th annual meeting of the BGCT this year. It's meeting in Waco in November. We still have an education commission. There are 10 universities that are partly supported by the commission, and they offer scholarships to ministerial students that attend those universities upon application. The Baptist Standard is still running strong. Eric Black is the editor, and we have been praying for Eric's father-in-law. Eric's father-in-law on our list at the bottom of the list because he has pancreatic cancer. The last printed version of it was in 2013. It also produces Common Call magazine, which was started in 2013, and it also does a regular podcast called On the Way. And of course, we give regularly to the Mary Hill Davis offering in the fall of every year to the tune of this year's goal of over $3 million. So Gambrell, I think, epitomizes all of these things, and we stand in the shadow of a Baptist giant.